Speaker, my question is to the Premier. Speaker, the Liberal government is trying to strong-arm the horse racing industry into accepting a deal that might hurt them in the long run. Just 2 weeks ago, the government sprang a massive, long-term funding agreement on horse people. It's nearly 200 pages and written in complex legal language. Here's the kicker. They gave the racetracks, breeders and horse people until May the 1st to sign the agreement, or else. Why is this government playing politics with horse people's livelihoods and pressuring them to sign onto a 19-year agreement in the final weeks before an election?
Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
So, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite makes reference to the fact that we have now strengthened and sustained horse racing and breeding by putting a $105 million 19-year agreement, Mr. Speaker. We've also provided an enhanced horse improvement program that is extended year over year by OMAFRA. We have a new, what's called a Racetrack Sustainability and Innovation Fund, $6 million over 3 years to support regional racetracks to innovate, diversify, and expand their revenue sources. And, Mr. Speaker, OLG is also providing additional funding to supplement those racetracks that may be experiencing shortfalls and enable long-term decisions about horse breeding. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, we've established a new board. The Ontario Racing Board will now be responsible for all the strategic plans and with also providing the service provider to ensure that those funds are transparent and accountable. And, Mr. Speaker, we're making it that there's going to have to be horse breeders on that board and small tracks on that board, 5 seats for racetracks, 5 seats for breeders, and an independent chair.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, back to the Premier. The Minister of Finance claims his long-term agreement, quote, will provide the stability needed to strengthen and sustain horse racing and breeding in Ontario. And yet that same minister has approved plans to rip the slot machines out of Kawartha Downs, Ajax Downs, and other community racetracks, threatening their future viability. Now, on the cusp of an election campaign, his officials are threatening to freeze out horse people if they don't sign on to a 19-year deal. Sign it or else. The deal that they haven't had time to read. What happens if one or more racetracks refuse to sign? Will the government cut off their funding, or will they set aside politics and let horse people have meaningful input after the election?
Minister of OMAFRA.
Minister of Agriculture, Food, Rural Affairs.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the supplementary from the member from Perth-Wellington. The reason that we chose 19 years, Mr. Speaker, $2 billion over those 20 years, because when you have insight in the horse racing industry in Ontario, it works on a cycle. It usually is 3 to 4. We usually work 3 to 4 years before a horse, whether it's a standard-bred horse or a thoroughbred horse.
Member from Halliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock is warned. Carry on.
Speaker, as we consulted widely with the industry, a thoroughbred horse or a standard-bred horse usually takes 3 or 4 years from the time it's born to the time it gets trained and eventually gets the track. So anything shorter than 19 years, you don't have the confidence in the industry. What are the things this government want to do to make sure there's a future path for all 15 tracks in the province of Ontario?